Talking about some of the science behind loving kindness, the psychological definition is focused and purposeful cultivation of benevolence and goodwill. And I'll say that one more time because it's pretty savory. Loving kindness psychologically is focused, purposeful cultivation of benevolence and goodwill. Now, with regard to that benevolence and that goodwill, it might seem like this should be really, really easy to extend to ourselves. But for a lot of people, they find that giving themselves the same type of kindness that they would give to a dear friend is a challenge. There's also some really interesting distinctions between loving kindness for others versus loving kindness for ourselves. And this is what some of the research that I'm doing here at Harvard Medical School is focusing on, is to understand both what are the psychological as well as the neurological distinctions between loving kindness for ourselves and for others. For example, one of the things that's coming into focus is that we can have loving kindness for others, but it doesn't necessarily automatically translate into forgiveness. To really get into a state of forgiving, it seems to require that we also extend that loving kindness to ourselves. To me, that's very fascinating. Other studies have indicated that loving kindness meditation specifically impacts neural processes that are very deep in the brain. I'm a neuroscientist by training, so when there are really clear effects on brain systems, that gets me really excited. Across 16 independent brain imaging studies, it's been observed that the largest cluster of activity in the brain when people are doing loving kindness practices is in a very deep brain region that's called the midbrain. More specifically, it's brain regions called the periaqueductal gray and the connections between the periaqueductal gray and a part of the brain called the ventral tegmental area. Okay, so now why is this interesting? Why does this matter? Well, part of the reason why it's interesting and why it starts to have philosophical relevance is because these parts of the midbrain are areas that were specifically elaborated on across all mammal species. So biologically, mammals are identified in large part by their caregiving instincts. Mammals, for example, have reproductive and nurturing strategies where the mother nurses the offspring. There's an elaborated kinship, so social connectedness and kin bonding within mammals that is specifically related to these elaborations of these deep midbrain structures. And so what's really beautiful then is as humans, we're largely differentiated neurologically by the development of our cerebral cortex, of that outer layer of our brains. And so you can think in terms of neurobiology across different species about mammals as having these capacities to form kin bonds and rich social connections. And then as humans, we have this precious opportunity to be intentional about how we activate and direct those deep capacities for kin connectedness and social bonding. And so when we're doing loving kindness practices, we're intentionally and skillfully activating those capacities that we naturally have for kin connectedness and for affectionate social bonding. And we're choosing to expand the radius and to be more and more inclusive of the other forms of life to whom we extend that warmth, that affection, that kinship. Historically and etymologically, with the history of the word kin and kind, they're directly related to each other. That the word kindness historically is reflecting that we have now extended that kin instinct to another, that we're kinned to them, that we're kind to them. And so I love this idea that we can be kin, we can become kinned to an increasing array of humans, of non-human sentience, and ultimately at this ideal to all of life. So that's one of the reasons too why these in Buddhist philosophical terms are referred to as immeasurables, because we can continue cultivating and expanding them without measure until, theoretically at least, they encompass all of life. We've extended that loving nature to all that exist. I want to talk about some of the typical challenges that are very common when people are trying to engage loving kindness but might hit an obstacle. So, one is self acceptance. As I said, for a lot of people, there might be a natural ease of extending their loving affection to others, and yet at the same time, a challenge of allowing that same type of loving affection to be absorbed or directed to one's own being. And for many, the most difficult challenge is feeling worthy of their own kindness. This can stem from habitualized self criticism, or from shame, or from guilt. And any of those habits of self criticism or those emotions of shame and guilt, they can block that flow of loving kindness to ourselves. Another common challenge to extending loving kindness is the challenge of forgiving. It can be very painful and very challenging to extend loving kindness to those who have caused us harm. And that can provoke resistance as the ego clings to past wrongs and protecting ourselves. Sometimes those feelings of resentment, they're there for protective reasons, and they may take some skillful work to soften them and to then allow the loving kindness to flow past those harms or through those harms in order to heal them, both in ourselves and in our relationships. And the third common challenge that I'll just mention for now is numbness. And numbness can also be a coping mechanism, especially if we've experienced, or not if, all of us to some degree or another have experienced traumas in our life and stressors. And so a coping mechanism for dealing with those traumas and those stressors can be to just go numb, or through seeking different ways of tuning out or of numbing ourselves. It can be a productive reflection to notice where we have emotional blockages in our practice of loving kindness. Are those emotional blockages related to self acceptance? Are they related to forgiveness? Are they related to that coping strategy to numb? With that first one of challenges of self kindness, some skillful ways that we can begin to work through those obstacles of extending kindness to ourselves are to work with simple phrases. For example, I am worthy of my own kindness. I am worthy of my own kindness. And oftentimes there can be phrases like that that on a certain cognitive level we can agree with, but it can take some time for the message to really be absorbed and for us to really integrate it into how we feel. And so it could be helpful as well to think of how you would speak to a dear, dear friend. What are the natural words that you would offer to a dear, beloved friend? And then playing with redirecting those same types of phrases to ourselves. Another micro practice that I'm quite fond of is connecting to your breath by taking slow, luxurious inhalations. And then with those slow, luxurious inhalations, to begin tethering them with the simple phrase, I love you, as you inhale. And once you've warmed the emotion with that phrase, I love you, on your inhalation. Begin exploring who you naturally can direct that to on the exhalation. So again, thinking perhaps of a dear friend, and as you inhale, letting that simple phrase, I love you, come into your mind. And then as you exhale, thinking about directing that loving intention to that dear friend. Again, playfully in a way of exploring and experimenting with your own loving nature. Having that deep inhalation, letting the phrase, I love you, become activated verbally in your mind. And then as you exhale, imagine it flowing into your own heart. And the goal here really is to make loving kindness something that is as easy and effortless as the breath itself. And taking permission to experiment, to explore, to play, to see where that flow of loving kindness naturally finds its own course. And then gradually building from there. And the last thing that I'll say for now about skillful strategies for loving kindness is a brief note about trauma sensitive practices. So, for those who are experiencing some degree of emotional numbness, perhaps first focus on mindfulness of your body and simply allowing sensations in your body to arise into your awareness. Reconnecting with the body's sensations can be a first step in restoring the capacity for emotional engagement and for empathy. And so perhaps you can reflect on what are the gentle practices that you can adopt in order to approach these places of resistance with care and with love. One more thing that I'll mention here before we wrap up is to identify some of the spiritual connections across various traditions. In Buddhism, loving kindness, or metta, as it's referred to, in English spelled Metta, it's a means to overcome mental defilements. And it leads to a softening of the ego and to a direct experience of interconnectedness. In that regard, practicing loving kindness in a Buddhist spiritual perspective becomes a path toward enlightenment that reveals the ultimate reality of interconnectedness between self and other. In Hinduism, the principle of ahimsa emphasizes nonviolence, not just in action, but even in thought. Loving kindness in this sense is not merely a passive feeling, but it's a transformative force that prevents harm and that fosters unity. And in Christian mysticism, teachings about agape or divine love that is selfless, unconditional, and freely given reflect the God nature of boundless love for humanity that we ourselves can participate in. I'll leave us in here with two aphorisms. The first is from the teachings known as the Dhammapada, the collection of teachings from the Buddha. And it says, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. And I'll repeat that again because there's so much rich wisdom to savor in it. Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. And then a second verse from Buddhist wisdom says, as the rain falls equally on the just and the unjust, do not burden your heart with judgments, but let your love fall on all.